Harold Patterson's hands stopped trembling mid-stroke as Kaiser's massive German Shepherd frame suddenly wrapped around his neck in the sterile veterinary clinic. But this wasn't their usual goodbye embrace. The dog's desperate whimper carried a pitch Harold had never heard in their 8 years together. Not grief, but warning. Dr. Victoria Blackwood's syringe clattered to the floor as Kaiser knocked Harold's water bottle from his trembling grip, the plastic container exploding against white tile and revealing crystalline residue that shouldn't exist in plain water. Jenny Morrison, the young veterinary technician, gasped and stumbled backward into the medicine cabinet, sending bottles cascading. Harold stared at the sparkling fragments scattered across the floor, remembering how Emma used to say his water tasted funny during her final weeks, the same weeks he'd trusted the wrong doctors. "Stop everything," Harold commanded, his Korean War instincts suddenly blazing to life after decades of dormancy. What had Kaiser detected that everyone else missed? And how many others hadn't been as fortunate to have a four-legged guardian angel? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Harold Eugene "Hank" Patterson had believed his biggest worry was whether Kaiser needed a sweater for their evening walks through Cedar Rapids' tree-lined neighborhoods. At 78, the retired high school principal had settled into a comfortable routine that would have made his late wife Emma proud. Morning coffee with the local paper, afternoon visits to the library, and quiet dinners with his German Shepherd companion who'd rescued him from loneliness just as much as Harold had rescued Kaiser from the shelter. The $450,000 house on Maple Street held 45 years of memories, paid off with Emma's life insurance and Harold's teacher's pension. His $1.2 million nest egg wasn't enormous by today's standards, but it provided security and dignity, enough to spoil Kaiser with premium dog food and emergency veterinary visits without checking his bank balance. "A penny saved is a penny earned," he'd tell his reflection each morning while shaving, echoing his Depression-era father's wisdom. Kaiser had arrived 2 years ago as a failed police dog candidate, deemed too protective for standard K-9 duty. The 8-year-old German Shepherd's intense brown eyes and muscular frame suggested noble breeding, but his excessive loyalty had made him unsuitable for law enforcement work. Harold hadn't cared about the dog's professional shortcomings. He'd needed a companion who understood loss, and Kaiser seemed to sense Harold's grief over Emma's 3-year-old absence. Their daily routine had remained unchanged until Dr. Victoria Blackwood opened her veterinary practice 8 months ago, bringing big city expertise to their small Iowa community. The 42-year-old professional carried herself with Chicago polish, her silver hair pulled into a practical bun, and white coat immaculate despite the messy reality of animal care. She'd impressed Harold immediately with her knowledge and seeming compassion, especially when discussing the special needs of elderly pets and their aging owners. Attorney James Crawford had appeared around the same time, introducing himself at Murphy's coffee shop with the easy charm of someone genuinely concerned about seniors' welfare. The 48-year-old specialized in elder law, he'd explained, helping retirees navigate the complex world of healthcare decisions and asset protection. His warm smile and firm handshake reminded Harold of the trustworthy professionals he'd worked alongside during his teaching career. Harold's granddaughter Sarah lived in Denver now, working as a trauma nurse and raising her 5-year-old son Tommy. Their phone calls had become less frequent over the past year, reduced to birthday wishes and holiday check-ins. Harold understood. Sarah had her own life to build, and he'd never wanted to be the needy grandfather who guilt-tripped his family into obligation. Besides, he had Kaiser, and that felt like enough most days. The comfortable predictability of Harold's world had been built on trust. Trust in professionals, trust in his community, trust in the basic goodness of people who smiled and shook hands firmly. He'd spent 45 years teaching American history, emphasizing the importance of civic virtue and social responsibility. That same faith in human decency now made him the perfect target for predators who understood exactly how to exploit an elderly man's deepest vulnerabilities, his love for his dog and his fear of becoming a burden. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Kaiser couldn't finish his breakfast. Harold watched from the kitchen doorway as his German shepherd sniffed the premium kibble, took a few half-hearted bites, then walked away with his tail lower than usual. In 2 years together, Kaiser had never left food in his bowl. The dog approached meals with the enthusiasm of someone who remembered hungrier days at the shelter. "Come on, boy," Harold coaxed, rattling the metal bowl. "It's your favorite." But Kaiser just looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes and retreated to his bed in the corner, something Harold had never seen during daylight hours. By Thursday, the coughing started, a dry, persistent hack that reminded Harold too painfully of Emma's early symptoms. Kaiser would wake them both at 3 in the morning, his body shaking with spasms that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Harold found himself pacing the hardwood floors of their Maple Street home, watching his companion struggle and feeling helpless in a way that brought back memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Friday morning brought the vomiting. Harold discovered Kaiser in the backyard, retching up what little water he'd managed to drink, his powerful frame reduced to trembling vulnerability. The sight hit Harold like a physical blow. This was exactly how Emma's decline had begun, with symptoms everyone had initially dismissed as minor inconveniences. "I can't lose you too," Harold whispered, kneeling beside Kaiser and stroking the dog's ears with hands that shook, despite his attempts at composure. "Not you, buddy. We're all each other's got." Dr. Blackwood's examination room felt too bright, too clinical, too much like the oncology ward where Harold had spent Emma's final months. Kaiser lay on the metal table panting heavily while Dr. Blackwood's practiced hands explored his abdomen and chest. Harold watched her face for any sign of hope, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "I'm concerned about what I'm feeling here," Dr. Blackwood said finally, her fingers pressing gently against Kaiser's ribcage. "There's some enlargement in the chest cavity that wasn't present during his last checkup. Combined with the respiratory symptoms and loss of appetite, we need to run comprehensive tests immediately." Harold's throat tightened. "What kind of tests? Blood work, chest x-rays, possibly a CT scan if the initial results confirm my suspicions?" Dr. Blackwood's voice carried the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered bad news regularly. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Patterson. In a dog Kaiser's age, these symptoms often indicate serious conditions. Early intervention could make all the difference." The estimate came to $3,500 for the complete diagnostic workup. Harold signed the authorization without hesitation, though he noticed his handwriting looked shakier than usual. Money meant nothing if Kaiser was sick. He'd learned that lesson during Emma's illness, when no amount of wealth could buy back stolen time. "We'll have the results tomorrow afternoon," Dr. Blackwood assured him, helping Kaiser down from the examination table. "Try not to worry too much. Dogs are remarkably resilient." But Harold had heard similar words before, from different doctors, about a different patient. Hope had become a dangerous emotion for him, something that hurt more than it helped when the inevitable disappointments arrived. That evening, as Harold sat in his recliner watching the local news with Kaiser resting heavily against his legs, the doorbell rang. James Crawford stood on the front porch holding a manila folder and wearing the concerned expression of a thoughtful neighbor. "Harold, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Crawford said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "I heard from Dr. Blackwood that Kaiser's having some health issues. As someone who's helped other seniors navigate medical crises, I thought you might benefit from some friendly advice." Harold invited him in, grateful for the company and the distraction from his spiraling worries. Crawford settled into Emma's old chair, the one Harold couldn't bring himself to move, and opened his folder with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to important conversations. Medical expenses can devastate fixed incomes, even comfortable ones, Crawford began, his voice carrying the warm authority of a trusted advisor. I've seen too many seniors forced to make impossible choices between their pet's care and their own financial security. There are legal strategies we can implement to protect your assets during a health crisis like this. Harold found himself nodding along, appreciating Crawford's straightforward approach to uncomfortable topics. The attorney's presence felt reassuring, like having a knowledgeable friend who understood the complexities of growing older in America. "What would you recommend?" Harold asked, unconsciously stroking Kaiser's fur as the dog dozed fitfully against his leg. Crawford smiled, the sort of practiced smile that had probably closed thousands of deals over the years. "Let me handle the financial coordination while you focus on Kaiser's care. It's what I do best, and it's what neighbors should do for each other." Dr. Blackwood's call came at exactly 2:17 p.m. the next day, interrupting Harold's lunch of soup and crackers that he couldn't taste. Kaiser lay motionless on his bed, having refused even water since morning, his breathing shallow and labored. The phone's shrill ring made Harold's heart race with anticipation and dread. "Mr. Patterson, I need you to come in immediately." Dr. Blackwood's voice carried an urgency that made Harold's knees weak. "The test results are more serious than we hoped." Harold's hands trembled as he helped Kaiser into the back seat of his 2018 Honda Civic, the same car he'd driven Emma to her final doctor's appointments. The 10-minute drive to the clinic felt like crossing a desert, with every red light stretching into eternity while Kaiser panted heavily behind him. In the examination room, Dr. Blackwood spread Kaiser's X-rays across the light board with the solemnity of a funeral director arranging flowers. The images showed Harold's worst fears materialized. Dark masses scattered throughout Kaiser's chest cavity like storm clouds across a summer sky. "Aggressive lung cancer," Dr. Blackwood announced, her finger tracing the ominous shadows. "It's already metastasized to multiple locations. In a dog Kaiser's age, this typically indicates a very advanced stage of the disease." Harold sank into the plastic chair, feeling the familiar weight of medical helplessness that had crushed him during Emma's illness. "How long does he have?" "Without treatment, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks. With aggressive chemotherapy and radiation, we might extend that to 6 months, possibly a year if we're fortunate." Dr. Blackwood's voice softened with practiced sympathy. "However, the treatment would be expensive, between $15,000 and $25,000, and quite harsh on his system." Many owners choose comfort care instead. The room seemed to tilt around Harold as he processed the impossible choice between Kaiser's suffering and his financial security. $25,000 would significantly impact his savings, but watching Kaiser die slowly would destroy what remained of his heart. "I need time to think," Harold managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, but time isn't our ally here," Dr. Blackwood replied, already preparing another syringe. "I'm going to give him something for the pain and difficulty breathing. It should make him more comfortable while you decide." That evening, James Crawford appeared at Harold's door carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the expression of someone bearing difficult news. He'd heard about Kaiser's diagnosis from Dr. Blackwood, he explained, and wanted to offer both condolences and practical advice. "These situations are exactly why I do what I do," Crawford said, settling into Emma's chair with familiar ease. "Pet medical expenses can bankrupt seniors faster than any other crisis. I've seen people lose their homes trying to save dying animals." Harold poured them each a glass of wine, grateful for Crawford's straightforward approach to uncomfortable realities. The attorney's presence felt reassuring during this latest crisis, like having a knowledgeable advocate who understood the harsh mathematics of fixed-income living. "What are my options?" Harold asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Crawford opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of legal documents. We need to establish a healthcare directive and temporary financial management arrangement immediately. If you become overwhelmed by grief and make impulsive decisions about expensive treatments, you could jeopardize your entire retirement security. The papers Crawford spread across Harold's coffee table looked official and comprehensive. Power of attorney forms, healthcare directives, and asset protection agreements that would temporarily transfer financial decision-making authority during this emotional crisis. It's just a precaution, Crawford explained, his pen already poised over signature lines. Once Kaiser's situation resolves, everything reverts back to your complete control. Think of it as insurance against making decisions with your heart instead of your head. Harold stared at the documents, remembering how Emma used to handle their financial decisions because she was better with numbers. The legal language seemed deliberately complex, but Crawford's explanations made sense. Grief could cloud judgment, and $25,000 represented a significant portion of his nest egg. Dr. Blackwood mentioned something about quality of life considerations. Harold said slowly, avoiding direct eye contact with Kaiser, who lay panting nearby. Maybe the kindest thing would be to let him go peacefully before the suffering gets worse. Crawford nodded solemnly. That's often the most loving choice. Euthanasia prevents prolonged agony, and the money saved could fund years of happiness for you, maybe traveling to see Sarah or finally taking that cruise you and Emma always planned. The word euthanasia hung in the air like a death sentence Harold couldn't bear to pronounce aloud. He'd never imagined facing this decision twice in one lifetime, first with Emma and now with Kaiser. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He'd rescued Kaiser from the shelter to save the dog's life, and now he was contemplating ending it. I can schedule the appointment for early next week, Crawford offered gently. Dr. Blackwood mentioned that waiting much longer would only increase Kaiser's discomfort. Sometimes love means making the hardest choices. Harold signed the papers with a hand that felt disconnected from his body, each signature feeling like another small surrender of control. Crawford witnessed the documents with professional efficiency, promising to file everything properly and handle the financial coordination during Harold's grief. As Crawford prepared to leave, he placed a comforting hand on Harold's shoulder. You're making the responsible choice. Emma would be proud of how you're handling this crisis. The mention of Emma's approval felt like both comfort and condemnation. Harold wondered what his wife would really think about the decisions he was making, but grief and exhaustion had left him too tired to trust his own judgment anymore. The week that followed felt like watching his own life through someone else's eyes. Harold moved through his daily routines with the mechanical precision of a man following a script he didn't remember writing. Kaiser's condition deteriorated with heartbreaking consistency, less food, more labored breathing, longer periods of motionless sleep that made Harold check repeatedly to ensure his companion was still alive. Dr. Blackwood's follow-up visits became more frequent, each one reinforcing the grim prognosis with clinical efficiency. She would examine Kaiser with professional thoroughness, adjusting pain medications and monitoring vital signs while discussing end-of-life options with the detached compassion Harold recognized from Emma's oncologists. The conversations always ended the same way, gentle reminders that Kaiser's suffering would only increase, and that merciful intervention represented the most loving choice. Crawford's presence became equally routine, appearing each evening with wine and sympathy, always carrying his leather briefcase filled with documents requiring Harold's signature. Asset protection forms, healthcare directives, insurance adjustments, each paper represented another layer of preparation for the inevitable. Harold signed them mechanically, trusting Crawford's expertise while his own judgment remained clouded by grief and exhaustion. Your bank called about some irregularities in your account access, Crawford mentioned casually on Thursday evening, pouring Harold a generous glass of red wine. I explained about the temporary financial management arrangement we established. They'll coordinate all transactions through my office until this crisis passes. Harold nodded absently, his attention focused on Kaiser's increasingly labored breathing. The dog hadn't moved from his bed all day, existing in a twilight state between sleep and consciousness that reminded Harold painfully of Emma's final weeks. The parallel felt too exact, too cruel, losing the two creatures he loved most to the same merciless disease progression. Yet something nagged at Harold's subconscious, a persistent itch he couldn't identify or scratch. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, especially when patterns seemed too convenient or coincidental. Three separate thoughts kept circling through his mind. Kaiser's rapid deterioration seemed unusually swift for cancer. Dr. Blackwood and Crawford had both arrived in Cedar Rapids within weeks of each other, and his normally sharp German Shepherd had developed an inexplicable wariness around both professionals. Friday morning brought Jenny Morrison's unexpected visit. The young veterinary technician appeared at Harold's front door during her lunch break, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and wearing the nervous expression of someone about to break important rules. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Jenny said, glancing over her shoulder as if checking for surveillance. "I wanted to see how Kaiser was doing outside the clinic environment." Harold invited her in, grateful for any distraction from his vigil beside Kaiser's bed. Jenny knelt beside the German Shepherd, stroking his ears with gentle familiarity while studying his condition with the keen eye of someone who genuinely loved animals. "Mr. Patterson, can I ask you something confidential?" Jenny's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Has Kaiser shown any unusual behaviors lately? Anything that seemed out of character before he got sick?" Harold considered the question carefully. "He's been drinking more water than usual, and sometimes he seems restless at night." "But I assume that was related to his illness." Jenny's expression grew troubled. "What about his appetite? Did the loss happen gradually, or was it sudden?" "Sudden," Harold replied without hesitation. "One day he was fine, the next day he wouldn't touch his food. It reminded me of my wife's cancer progression, actually, how quickly everything changed." The young woman's face paled slightly. She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at Kaiser, as if wrestling with a decision that could have serious consequences. "Mr. Patterson, I'm going to say something that could get me fired, but I care too much about animals to stay silent," Jenny said, her voice trembling with nervous determination. "Kaiser's symptoms don't match typical cancer progression. The timeline is wrong, the presentation is atypical, and his blood work shows inconsistencies that bother me." Harold felt his heart rate accelerate. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Kidney values that fluctuate in patterns I've never seen with cancer. Neurological responses that suggest toxicity rather than malignancy." "And his X-rays?" Jenny paused, clearly struggling with professional ethics. "Sometimes second opinions can save lives, Mr. Patterson. Animals can't advocate for themselves." Her words hung in the air like an accusation Harold wasn't ready to process. The implication challenged everything he'd accepted about Kaiser's diagnosis, everything Crawford had helped him prepare for. If Kaiser wasn't dying of cancer, then the financial arrangements, the euthanasia scheduling, the entire framework of decisions he'd made would need complete reevaluation. "Are you suggesting Dr. Blackwood made a mistake?" Harold asked carefully. Jenny stood up slowly, her professional training warring with her ethical instincts. "I'm suggesting that Kaiser deserves every possible chance and that you deserve to be absolutely certain before making irreversible decisions. Independent veterinary opinions exist for a reason." After Jenny left, Harold found himself staring at Kaiser with fresh eyes. The dog's breathing remained labored, his appetite non-existent, his energy depleted, but Jenny's questions had planted seeds of doubt that grew rapidly in Harold's mind. He began noticing details that had previously escaped his attention: how Kaiser seemed most uncomfortable after Dr. Blackwood's visits, how the dog's water consumption patterns coincided with specific medications, how his symptoms worsened after certain treatments. Harold's teaching experience had trained him to recognize patterns, to question assumptions, and to seek multiple sources before accepting conclusions. The same analytical skills that had served him well in 45 years of education now demanded he examine Kaiser's situation with fresh skepticism. That evening, Crawford arrived earlier than usual, carrying legal documents that required immediate attention. The attorney's manner seemed more rushed, less casual than their previous conversations. "We need to finalize the euthanasia scheduling," Crawford announced, settling into Emma's chair with businesslike efficiency. "Dr. Blackwood recommends Tuesday morning. Waiting longer will only increase Kaiser's suffering unnecessarily." Harold looked at the appointment forms Crawford spread across the coffee table, each signature line representing another step toward Kaiser's death. The finality felt premature, rushed in ways that contradicted the careful deliberation Emma's doctors had always encouraged. "What if we sought a second opinion first?" Harold suggested tentatively. Crawford's expression shifted subtly, revealing a flash of irritation before resuming its practiced sympathy. "Harold, we've discussed this. Prolonging the inevitable only increases everyone's suffering. Dr. Blackwood is highly qualified. Questioning her expertise at this stage seems counterproductive." But Harold's military instincts were fully activated now, recognizing something that felt like manipulation disguised as concern. Crawford's eagerness to finalize arrangements struck him as suspicious rather than helpful. Why was a lawyer so invested in a dog's medical timeline? "I think I'd like to get Kaiser examined by someone else before making final decisions," Harold said with growing firmness. Crawford's mask slipped further, revealing genuine anger beneath the compassionate facade. "That's exactly the kind of emotional decision-making we established the financial management arrangement to prevent. You're not thinking clearly, Harold." "Grief is compromising your judgment." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to feel plausible. Harold had been grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed by the parallels between Kaiser's illness and Emma's death. But Jenny's visit had reminded him that even grief-stricken pet owners deserved accurate diagnoses and honest medical advice. "Maybe my judgment is compromised," Harold acknowledged, "but Kaiser's my responsibility. I need to be absolutely certain before I end his life." Crawford gathered his papers with barely concealed frustration. "You're making a mistake that will cost Kaiser unnecessary suffering. But if you insist on second opinions and expensive delays, that's your choice. Just remember that every day you postpone the inevitable is another day of pain for that poor animal." After Crawford left, Harold sat beside Kaiser's bed, stroking the German shepherd's ears while processing the evening's revelations. His companion's breathing remained labored, but something in Kaiser's eyes seemed more alert, more present than it had been in days, almost as if the dog sensed that help might finally be coming. Harold pulled out his phone and began researching veterinary specialists in the Cedar Rapids area, determined to find someone who could either confirm Kaiser's terminal diagnosis or identify whatever was really wrong. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was fighting for his companion instead of simply managing his death. Kaiser lifted his head slightly and looked directly at Harold, his intelligent eyes reflecting gratitude that transcended species barriers. Whatever was wrong with his beloved German shepherd, Harold refused to give up without exhausting every possibility. Emma had taught him that love meant fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. The decision felt like emerging from fog into clarity, trading passive acceptance for active hope. Harold would find answers no matter what Crawford or Dr. Blackwood recommended. Kaiser deserved that much, and so did Harold's conscience. Saturday morning arrived with Harold's first real sense of purpose in weeks. He'd scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Michael Torres at the Cedar Rapids Animal Emergency Center for 10 a.m., despite Crawford's increasingly frantic phone calls urging him to reconsider. Kaiser seemed to sense the change in Harold's energy. The German Shepherd managed to lift his head and wag his tail weakly when Harold announced they were going for a car ride. The emergency clinic bustled with weekend activity, a stark contrast to Dr. Blackwood's pristine but eerily quiet practice. Dr. Torres, a compact man in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes, examined Kaiser with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd seen every possible variation of canine illness. Harold watched the veterinarian's face carefully, searching for any sign of the grim certainty that had characterized Dr. Blackwood's diagnoses. "These X-rays are interesting, Doctor," Torres murmured after 40 minutes of examination, holding Kaiser's films up to the light. "Mr. Patterson, when were these taken?" "3 days ago at Dr. Blackwood's clinic," Harold replied, his heart racing with anticipation. Dr. Torres frowned, comparing the X-rays with his own physical examination findings. "I'm seeing some inconsistencies between what these films show and what I'm finding during my hands-on assessment. Kaiser's lung sounds are clearer than I'd expect with this level of metastatic disease." The word inconsistencies triggered Harold's memory of Jenny Morrison's similar concerns. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "These masses appear quite advanced, but Kaiser's breathing patterns and chest wall flexibility suggest less severe compromise than the X-rays indicate." Dr. Torres set the films aside and looked directly at Harold. "I'd like to run our own imaging studies and blood work." Sometimes X-rays can be misinterpreted, especially when taken at unusual angles or with outdated equipment. Harold authorized the additional tests without hesitation, though he noticed his hands trembling as he signed the consent forms. The possibility that Kaiser might not be dying felt almost too dangerous to hope for. False hope had nearly destroyed him during Emma's illness, and he wasn't sure he could survive that emotional roller coaster again. While waiting for test results, Harold called Sarah in Denver, something he hadn't done in 3 weeks. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which struck him as odd since she typically answered calls from family members immediately. He left a message explaining Kaiser's situation and asking her to call back as soon as possible. Dr. Torres returned an hour later carrying Kaiser's new test results and wearing an expression Harold couldn't interpret. The veterinarian sat down across from Harold with the deliberate care of someone preparing to deliver life-changing news. "Mr. Patterson, I have some very unusual findings to discuss with you," Dr. Torres began, spreading the new X-rays alongside the original films from Dr. Blackwood's clinic. "Our imaging shows no evidence of the extensive lung masses depicted in these earlier X-rays. None whatsoever." Harold stared at the 2 sets of films, his mind struggling to process the contradiction. How is that possible? Cancer doesn't just disappear. "It doesn't," Dr. Torres agreed grimly, "which raises serious questions about the accuracy of the original diagnosis. Our blood work shows elevated kidney values and neurological markers consistent with toxic exposure, not malignant disease." The room seemed to tilt around Harold as the implications became clear. "Are you saying Kaiser was poisoned?" "I'm saying Kaiser's symptoms are consistent with chronic low-level toxin exposure, specifically something like antifreeze or similar chemicals that cause kidney damage and neurological symptoms that can mimic other conditions." Dr. Torres's voice carried the controlled anger of a professional who'd discovered potential animal abuse. "The good news is that this type of poisoning is often treatable if caught early enough." Harold's mind raced through the past few weeks, searching for any explanation of how Kaiser could have been exposed to antifreeze. He kept his garage locked, stored all chemicals safely, and Kaiser never roamed unsupervised, unless... Doctor, could someone have been giving Kaiser small amounts of poison over time, enough to make him sick but not kill him immediately? Dr. Torres nodded soberly. That's exactly what this looks like. Deliberate, calculated poisoning designed to create specific symptoms. Whoever did this had medical knowledge and access to your dog on a regular basis. The truth hit Harold like a physical blow. Dr. Blackwood had been treating Kaiser for weeks, administering medications and supplements during each visit. She had complete access, medical knowledge, and most importantly, Harold's complete trust. The fake x-rays, the rushed timeline for euthanasia, Crawford's pressure to avoid second opinions, everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. Harold pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called the Cedar Rapids Police Department, asking to speak with someone about suspected animal abuse and possible fraud. The dispatcher connected him with Detective Lisa Chen, who listened to Harold's story with growing concern. "Mr. Patterson, what you're describing sounds like it could be part of a larger pattern," Detective Chen said after Harold finished explaining the situation. "We've had several reports of unusual financial arrangements involving elderly residents and the same attorney you mentioned. Can you come to the station immediately?" While Harold drove to the police station with Kaiser resting more comfortably in the back seat, Dr. Torres had begun immediate treatment for the poisoning. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic calls from Crawford. Harold ignored them, focusing instead on the growing realization that he'd been targeted by sophisticated predators who'd nearly succeeded in stealing both his beloved companion and his financial security. At the police station, Detective Chen introduced Harold to FBI agent Patricia Williams, who specialized in elder fraud cases. Agent Williams had been investigating a multi-state network of professionals who targeted wealthy seniors through fake medical emergencies involving their pets. "Your case fits the pattern perfectly," Agent Williams explained, showing Harold files on 12 similar cases across 4 states. A veterinarian creates a fake terminal diagnosis. An attorney appears to help with financial planning, and within weeks the victim has signed over power of attorney and is facing expensive medical decisions that drain their resources. Harold studied the photographs of other victims, elderly men and women who'd trusted the wrong professionals with their pets and their life savings. How many of them lost their animals? Agent Williams' expression darkened. All of them. Until now, no one has caught the scheme early enough to save their pet and expose the network. The FBI agent explained that they'd been tracking Dr. Blackwood and Crawford for months, waiting for sufficient evidence to make arrests. Harold's case, with its fake x-rays and documented poisoning, provided the proof they needed to bring down the entire operation. "We'll need you to wear a recording device for your next meeting with Crawford," Agent Williams requested. "Let him think you're going through with the euthanasia, but try to get him to admit details about the financial arrangements." Harold agreed immediately, though the thought of confronting Crawford while pretending to cooperate made his stomach churn. The idea that he'd nearly killed Kaiser based on lies filled him with rage that decades of teaching had never prepared him to handle. As Harold prepared to leave the police station, Detective Chen handed him a business card. "Mr. Patterson, there's one more thing. We found records showing that Dr. Blackwood has been intercepting phone calls to several elderly clients, including attempts by family members to reach them." "You mentioned your granddaughter hasn't returned your calls?" Harold's blood ran cold as he realized Sarah might have been trying to reach him for weeks, only to have her calls blocked by the same people who'd been systematically destroying his life. The isolation he'd attributed to natural family dynamics had been artificially created to make him more vulnerable to manipulation. On the drive home, Harold called Sarah's hospital directly, identifying himself as her grandfather and explaining that he had a family emergency. The charge nurse connected him immediately, and Sarah's voice broke when she heard him. "Grandpa, I've been trying to call you for 3 weeks," Sarah sobbed. "Some man claiming to be your attorney told me you were developing dementia and didn't want to be disturbed, but I knew something was wrong." Harold pulled over to the side of the road, overcome by relief and rage in equal measure. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. I'm fine. Kaiser is going to be fine, and the people who tried to convince you otherwise are about to be arrested." As he explained the situation to his granddaughter, Harold realized that Crawford and Dr. Blackwood's most serious mistake had been underestimating his love for Kaiser and his family. They'd assumed grief would make him passive, but instead it had awakened the fighter Emma had always known existed beneath his gentle teacher's exterior. Kaiser lifted his head from the back seat and looked at Harold with eyes that already seemed brighter, more alert than they'd been in weeks. The German shepherd seemed to understand that the battle was far from over, but that they were finally fighting on the right side. The confrontation Harold had dreaded arrived Tuesday morning, exactly when Dr. Blackwood had scheduled Kaiser's euthanasia appointment. Harold sat in his living room, wearing the FBI's recording device beneath his flannel shirt, watching Crawford pace nervously near the window. The attorney's usual polish had cracked overnight. His hair looked uncombed, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he checked his phone repeatedly. "Harold, we need to discuss some complications that have arisen," Crawford began, his voice lacking its typical smooth confidence. "Dr. Blackwood mentioned you sought a second opinion yesterday. That kind of delay is exactly what we were trying to avoid." Harold forced himself to remain calm, remembering Agent Williams's instructions to let Crawford reveal details naturally. "I was just being thorough. Emma always said I should get second opinions on important decisions." Crawford's expression hardened. "Your wife isn't here to give advice anymore, Harold, and frankly, your recent behavior suggests the mild cognitive decline we've been monitoring is progressing faster than anticipated." The casual cruelty of using Emma's death as a weapon made Harold's blood boil, but he maintained his facade of confused compliance. "Maybe you're right. The stress of Kaiser's illness has been overwhelming." "Exactly why we established the financial management arrangement," Crawford continued, pulling documents from his briefcase with renewed confidence. "Dr. Blackwood called this morning. Kaiser had a very difficult night. His suffering is becoming unbearable. She's waiting for us at the clinic." Harold nodded slowly, though every instinct screamed against walking into what he now recognized as a carefully orchestrated trap. "I suppose it's time to let him go peacefully." Crawford's relief was visible. "You're making the compassionate choice. After the procedure, we'll need to discuss your living situation. The stress of pet ownership might be too much for someone experiencing cognitive changes." The suggestion that Harold might need residential care felt like the final piece of their scheme clicking into place. First, steal the pet that provided emotional stability, then convince the victim they couldn't live independently, finally gain complete control over their assets through legal guardianship. At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Blackwood greeted them with professional sympathy that now struck Harold as completely artificial. She led them to the same examination room where this nightmare had begun, Kaiser's medical chart already prepared with the final entries. "I've prepared a sedative to help Kaiser relax before the final injection," Dr. Blackwood explained, drawing medication into a syringe with practiced efficiency. "It will make the transition peaceful and painless." Harold watched her movements carefully, noticing details he'd missed during previous visits. Her hands moved too quickly, her explanations felt rehearsed, and she avoided direct eye contact with Kaiser, behavior patterns inconsistent with a veterinarian genuinely concerned about animal welfare. "Before we proceed, could I have a few minutes alone with Kaiser?" Harold requested. "I'd like to say goodbye privately." Dr. Blackwood exchanged glances with Crawford. "Of course, but please don't take too long. Prolonging this moment only increases everyone's emotional distress." After they left the room, Harold knelt beside Kaiser and whispered directly into his ear, "Hold on, buddy. Help is coming." The German shepherd's eyes seemed more alert than they'd been in weeks, as if Dr. Torres's treatment was already reversing the effects of chronic poisoning. When Dr. Blackwood returned, she carried the euthanasia solution with ceremonial solemnity. "Are you ready, Mr. Patterson?" Harold nodded, his throat tight with genuine emotion, despite knowing Kaiser would survive this encounter. The FBI had assured him they would intervene before any actual harm occurred, but watching the charade unfold still felt like participating in his companion's murder. Dr. Blackwood approached Kaiser with the syringe, but the German shepherd suddenly lurched upward with surprising strength, knocking the injection from her hands. The clear liquid splattered across the floor while Kaiser positioned himself protectively between Harold and the veterinarian. "Restrain him!" Dr. Blackwood snapped, her professional mask slipping to reveal cold anger underneath. "Crawford, help me hold the animal down!" Crawford moved toward Kaiser, but the German shepherd's growl stopped him mid-step. 8 years of protective instincts and 2 years of bonding with Harold had created a formidable guardian who sensed danger with military precision. "Something's wrong with this picture," Harold said slowly, standing up with newfound confidence. "Kaiser's acting like he's protecting me from both of you." Dr. Blackwood's face flushed with frustration. "The animal is confused and frightened. That's why we need to complete the procedure quickly." But Harold was studying Kaiser's behavior with fresh eyes, recognizing the intelligence and purposefulness behind actions he'd previously attributed to illness-induced confusion. "He's not confused. He's trying to tell me something." Crawford stepped forward aggressively. "Harold, you signed legal documents giving me authority during medical crises. I'm ordering you to allow Dr. Blackwood to complete the euthanasia." The word ordering triggered Harold's military training and 45 years of classroom authority. No one ordered him around in situations involving his family, whether human or canine. "I'm withdrawing my consent," Harold announced firmly. "Kaiser is my dog, and I'm taking him home." Dr. Blackwood moved to block the door. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The animal is suffering, and allowing him to continue deteriorating would constitute abuse under state law." Crawford pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Adult Protective Services. Harold's clearly experiencing a psychological crisis that's affecting his judgment." But Harold was no longer the isolated, grief-stricken widower they'd been manipulating for weeks. "Actually, I think you should call the police. I have some very interesting questions about Kaiser's medical treatment and my financial arrangements." The room fell silent except for Kaiser's protective growling and the sound of footsteps approaching in the hallway outside. Agent Williams and Detective Chen had been monitoring the recording device, waiting for exactly this moment when the predators revealed their true nature. Harold looked down at Kaiser, whose tail was wagging despite the tense situation. "Good boy. You tried to warn me all along, didn't you?" The examination room door burst open as FBI agent Patricia Williams and Detective Lisa Chen stormed in with 3 uniformed officers behind them. Dr. Blackwood dropped the syringe she'd been preparing while Crawford instinctively reached for his briefcase, then froze when he saw the weapons drawn. "Doctor, Victoria Blackwood and James Crawford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder fraud, animal abuse, and theft by deception," Agent Williams announced, her voice cutting through the sudden chaos like a blade. Crawford's composure shattered completely. "This is ridiculous. Harold signed legal documents granting me power of attorney during his medical crisis. Everything we've done has been legitimate estate planning." "Including poisoning his dog with antifreeze to create a fake medical crisis?" Detective Chen asked while handcuffing Dr. Blackwood, who remained silent with the calculating expression of someone already planning legal defenses. Harold watched the arrests unfold with a mixture of vindication and horror. These people had nearly destroyed his life through methodical manipulation, targeting his love for Kaiser and his grief over Emma's death. The recording device had captured their entire conspiracy, from Crawford's threats about residential care to Dr. Blackwood's admission that Kaiser's suffering was irreversible. "Mr. Patterson, are you all right?" Agent Williams asked, while officers searched Crawford's briefcase and discovered financial documents belonging to 14 other elderly victims. "I think so," Harold managed, though his legs felt unsteady. Kaiser pressed against his side, offering comfort with the intuitive wisdom that had tried to warn Harold for weeks. Jenny Morrison appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Agent Williams, I have Kaiser's real medical records and documentation of every fake treatment Dr. Blackwood administered. The antifreeze poisoning started 3 weeks ago, always in small doses during routine visits." Dr. Blackwood finally spoke, her voice cold and unrepentant. "You have no idea what it's like watching wealthy elderly people waste resources on dying animals while families lose everything to medical bills. I was redistributing assets to people who actually needed them." "By stealing from seniors and torturing their pets?" Harold asked, his teacher's voice carrying the moral authority that had commanded respect for 45 years. "Your dog was dying anyway," Dr. Blackwood replied with chilling indifference. "I just accelerated the timeline for everyone's benefit." Agent Williams stepped between Harold and Dr. Blackwood before the conversation could escalate further. "Save it for your lawyer. You'll have plenty of time to explain your philosophy to a federal judge." As the officers led Crawford and Dr. Blackwood away in handcuffs, Harold sank into the examination room's plastic chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had almost happened. Kaiser rested his head on Harold's lap, no longer the dying animal from an hour ago, but a recovering German shepherd whose loyalty had literally saved both their lives. "Grandpa!" Sarah's voice echoed through the clinic as she ran down the hallway, having driven straight through from Denver after Harold's call. She burst into the room and wrapped both Harold and Kaiser in a desperate embrace, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was going to lose you," she sobbed. "When that man told me you were developing dementia and didn't want contact with family, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help." Harold held his granddaughter tight, feeling the return of family connections that Crawford had systematically severed. "They isolated me from everyone who could have helped. If Kaiser hadn't kept fighting their fake treatments, I never would have questioned their story." Dr. Torres arrived 20 minutes later to examine Kaiser and provide medical testimony for the criminal case. His preliminary assessment was optimistic. The German shepherd's kidney function was already improving with proper treatment, and the neurological symptoms from antifreeze poisoning should resolve completely within weeks. "This is one of the most systematic cases of veterinary fraud I've ever encountered," Dr. Torres told Agent Williams while reviewing Kaiser's falsified medical records. "The fake X-rays alone required sophisticated equipment and knowledge. This wasn't opportunistic crime, it was carefully planned exploitation." Agent Williams nodded grimly. "Crawford and Dr. Blackwood have been operating in 4 states over 3 years. We've identified 17 victims, though we suspect there are more who never reported the crimes because they believed their pets actually died of natural causes." Harold felt sick thinking about other elderly people who'd been forced to euthanize healthy animals based on lies. "How many others went through what I almost went through?" "Too many," Agent Williams replied. "But your case gives us the evidence to shut down their entire network and prosecute everyone involved. The recordings from today will help convict not just Crawford and Dr. Blackwood, but their associates in other states." As they prepared to leave the clinic, Jenny Morrison approached Harold with obvious nervousness. "Mr. Patterson, I need to apologize. I suspected something was wrong weeks ago, but I was afraid to speak up directly. I should have been braver." Harold placed a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You did speak up when it mattered most. Your questions made me seek that second opinion, and that saved Kaiser's life. Sometimes courage means planting seeds of doubt in the right moment." The drive home felt surreal after weeks of believing Kaiser was dying. Harold's German shepherd sat alert in the passenger seat, his breathing clear and his eyes bright with returning health. Sarah followed in her rental car, planning to stay for 2 weeks while Kaiser completed his recovery and Harold processed the emotional trauma of nearly losing everything he loved. At home, Harold called the other elderly victims whose names Agent Williams had provided. One by one, he spoke with survivors of Crawford and Dr. Blackwood's scheme, listening to heartbreakingly similar stories of beloved pets diagnosed with fake terminal illnesses, financial controls imposed during emotional crises, and family relationships severed through manipulation. Mrs. Dorothy Weinstein, an 82-year-old widow from Des Moines, wept when Harold told her that her cat, Mittens, had probably been healthy when she'd agreed to euthanasia 6 months earlier. They told me he was suffering terribly from kidney failure. I held him while they put him to sleep, thinking I was being merciful. Each conversation reinforced Harold's growing understanding of how sophisticated and cruel the scheme had been. The predators had studied their victims' psychological vulnerabilities, targeting the deep bonds between elderly people and their companion animals to create artificial medical crises that justified financial control. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in Emma's kitchen and Kaiser dozed peacefully on his favorite rug, Harold reflected on how close he'd come to losing everything. The recording device had captured not just confessions of criminal activity, but the callous indifference of people who viewed elderly citizens as disposable sources of income. "Grandpa, I found something while going through the papers Crawford had you sign," Sarah said, holding up a document that made Harold's blood run cold. "He'd already started proceedings to have you declared incompetent and moved to a memory care facility. If Kaiser had died Tuesday, you would have been institutionalized by Friday." The full scope of their plan became clear. Kill the pet that provided emotional support and companionship, then use the victim's grief and isolation to justify legal guardianship and residential placement. Harold's comfortable home would have been sold, his assets managed by Crawford, and his independence eliminated completely. "They almost succeeded," Harold said quietly, stroking Kaiser's ears while his companion slept. "If you hadn't recovered enough to fight back in that examination room, we'd both be gone." Sarah sat beside her grandfather on the sofa, creating the 3-generation family unit that Crawford had tried to destroy. "What happens now? Do you feel safe staying here?" Harold considered the question carefully. The immediate physical danger had passed with the arrests, but the emotional impact of systematic betrayal would take time to heal. His trust in medical professionals, legal advisors, and helpful strangers had been shattered by people who'd exploited his widower's loneliness and his love for Kaiser. "I feel safer than I have in weeks," Harold replied honestly. "Knowing the truth makes everything else manageable, and having you here reminds me that I'm not as alone as they wanted me to believe." Kaiser stirred at the sound of voices, lifting his head to look at Harold with eyes that held recognition, gratitude, and the unbreakable loyalty that had saved them both. The German shepherd's tail wagged slowly, a simple gesture that carried more meaning than any words could express. The worst had passed, but Harold understood that recovery would be a long process requiring vigilance, family support, and the hard-won wisdom that some people viewed kindness as weakness to be exploited. Kaiser had taught him that love sometimes means fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves, even when the battle seems hopeless. Tomorrow would bring media interviews, legal proceedings, and the difficult work of rebuilding trust. But tonight, Harold sat in his own home with his granddaughter and his faithful companion, surrounded by the love that no amount of money could buy and no criminal scheme could ultimately destroy. 6 months later, Harold Patterson stood at the podium of the Cedar Rapids Community Center, looking out at an audience of 200 elderly residents, their adult children, and local officials who'd gathered for the first annual Elder Protection Awareness Conference. Kaiser sat beside him on the stage, wearing a red service dog vest that identified him as a certified therapy animal, his German Shepherd dignity intact, despite the attention from photographers and reporters. "My name is Harold Patterson, and 6 months ago, I almost made the biggest mistake of my life," Harold began, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in classrooms for 45 years. "I almost killed my best friend because I trusted the wrong people at the worst possible time." The audience listened with rapt attention as Harold recounted his story, from Kaiser's fake cancer diagnosis to the moment FBI agents arrested Crawford and Dr. Blackwood in the veterinary clinic. He spoke without notes, having told this story dozens of times to law enforcement officials, reporters, and victims' advocacy groups across the Midwest. "The hardest lesson I learned is that grief makes us vulnerable in ways we never expect," Harold continued, his hand resting on Kaiser's head. "These criminals didn't target my money. They targeted my love for Kaiser and my loneliness after Emma's death. They understood that elderly people will do anything to avoid losing the companions who keep us connected to life." Sarah Patterson Mills sat in the front row, 8 months pregnant with her second child and glowing with health. She'd moved back to Cedar Rapids permanently, taking a position as head trauma nurse at Mercy Medical Center and buying a house 3 blocks from Harold's home on Maple Street. Her 5-year-old son, Tommy, had become Kaiser's devoted companion, the two of them inseparable during their daily walks through the neighborhood. "Grandpa Harold tells the best stories," Tommy had announced to his kindergarten class during show and tell, bringing Kaiser as his special guest. "And Kaiser is the smartest dog in the whole world because he saved Grandpa from bad people who wanted to hurt him." The criminal trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with overwhelming convictions for both Crawford and Dr. Blackwood. Crawford received 15 years in federal prison for elder fraud, while Dr. Blackwood faced 12 years plus lifetime revocation of her veterinary license. Their multi-state network had been completely dismantled, leading to additional arrests in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Agent Patricia Williams had testified that Harold's case represented the most sophisticated elder abuse scheme the FBI had encountered, with total victim losses exceeding $8.3 million across 17 confirmed cases. The recording device evidence had been crucial in securing convictions, but Harold's willingness to confront his attackers had provided the emotional impact that convinced jurors of the crime's devastating human cost. "We recovered $7.2 million in stolen assets," Agent Williams had announced at the trial's conclusion. "But the real victory is that Harold Patterson's courage prevented dozens of other families from experiencing this nightmare." The financial recovery had enabled Harold to establish the Emma and Kaiser Foundation, dedicated to protecting elderly citizens and their companion animals from medical fraud. The foundation provided funding for second veterinary opinions, legal advocacy for seniors facing financial abuse, and educational programs that taught families to recognize warning signs of exploitation. Dr. Michael Torres had become the foundation's chief medical advisor, developing protocols that other veterinary practices could implement to prevent fraudulent diagnoses. His research into Kaiser's case had been published in the Journal of Veterinary Medicine, establishing new standards for confirming terminal diagnoses before recommending euthanasia. "Every animal deserves advocates who will question suspicious timelines and demand verification," Dr. Torres had written in his landmark paper. "Kaiser's survival proves that second opinions can literally mean the difference between life and death." Jenny Morrison had emerged as an unlikely hero, receiving statewide recognition for her ethical courage in questioning Dr. Blackwood's practices. She'd completed her veterinary degree with financial assistance from the Emma and Kaiser Foundation and now worked as Dr. Torres's partner, specializing in elderly pet care and owner education. I learned that staying silent about suspicious behavior makes you complicit in the abuse, Jenny told audiences during her speaking engagements. Sometimes protecting animals means protecting their human families from people who exploit the human-animal bond for profit. The community response had exceeded Harold's most optimistic expectations. Cedar Rapids had become a model for elder protection programs, with neighboring cities sending delegations to study their methods. The coffee shop network had evolved into an official senior citizen watch program, with trained volunteers making daily wellness checks on isolated elderly residents. Mrs. Dorothy Weinstein had become Harold's closest collaborator, channeling her grief over Mittens's unnecessary death into fierce advocacy for other pet owners. At 82, she'd learned to use social media and maintained a Facebook page with 12,000 followers who shared information about suspected animal abuse and elder fraud. "That cat was the only family I had left," Dorothy told newspaper reporters. "When they convinced me to put him down for fake kidney disease, they didn't just kill my pet, they killed my will to keep living. Harold's story showed me that Mittens died for nothing but their greed." The legal system had responded with unprecedented reforms. Iowa had passed Harold's Law, requiring mandatory waiting periods and independent second opinions before euthanizing animals belonging to elderly owners. Similar legislation was pending in 8 other states, with bipartisan support from legislators who recognized the vulnerability of aging constituents. Harold's testimony before Congress had been broadcast nationally, bringing elder abuse into mainstream conversation in ways that statistics and policy papers never could. His appearance on 60 Minutes had generated over 50,000 calls to elder abuse hotlines, leading to investigations of suspicious cases across the country. "The most evil part of their scheme was making me believe that choosing death was an act of love," Harold had told correspondent Leslie Stahl. "They convinced me that ending Kaiser's life would demonstrate my compassion, when the truly loving choice was fighting for more time together." Kaiser's recovery had been complete within 3 months, his kidney function returning to normal and his energy restored to levels Harold hadn't seen since adopting him from the shelter. The German Shepherd's new career as a therapy dog had brought him into contact with hundreds of nursing home residents, hospital patients, and other elderly individuals who found comfort in his calm presence. "Dogs don't lie about their feelings," Harold observed during his speaking engagements. "Kaiser tried to warn me for weeks that something was wrong, but I was so focused on trusting medical authority that I ignored his instincts." Animals see through deception in ways that humans often can't. The therapy dog program had expanded to include 12 specially trained animals working in elder care facilities throughout Iowa. Each dog wore a collar tag with the Emma and Kaiser Foundation logo and a phone number for reporting suspected abuse, creating an informal network of 4-legged guardians watching over vulnerable populations. Harold's daily routine now included activities he'd never imagined during his quiet retirement years. Morning walks with Kaiser had expanded to include visits with homebound neighbors, afternoon correspondence with other victims' families, and evening phone calls with legislators crafting elder protection laws. "Emma would have been proud of what you've accomplished," Sarah told her grandfather during one of their weekly family dinners. "She always said you had more fight in you than you realized." Harold smiled, watching Tommy teach Kaiser new tricks in the backyard, while Sarah's husband David grilled hamburgers for their extended family gathering. The isolation that Crawford had systematically created had been replaced by connections deeper and more meaningful than Harold had experienced since Emma's death. "Your grandmother was right about most things," Harold replied. "She always told me to trust but verify, and that love means fighting for the people who matter most. I just wish I'd remembered her wisdom before almost losing Kaiser." The Foundation's work continued expanding, with new programs launching monthly in response to emerging needs. Harold had hired a full-time staff of 6, including a former FBI agent specializing in financial crimes and a veterinarian focused on detecting abuse in animal-human relationships. As Harold concluded his speech at the community center, the audience rose in sustained applause. Kaiser stood beside him, tail wagging with the dignity of a dog who understood his importance in preventing others from experiencing their trauma. "The question everyone asks me is whether I trust people anymore," Harold said, his voice carrying across the quiet auditorium. "The answer is yes, but differently than before. I trust the people who earn that trust through consistent actions, transparent motives, and genuine care for outcomes rather than profits. I trust my family, my real friends, and my community members who've proven their character through difficult times." He looked down at Kaiser, whose brown eyes reflected the unshakable loyalty that had saved both their lives. "Most of all, I trust this old German shepherd, who taught me that love sometimes means questioning authority, demanding second opinions, and fighting for more time together, even when experts tell you to give up." After the conference, Harold and Kaiser drove home through neighborhoods that had become safer and more connected because of their shared ordeal. The maple trees lining their street were beginning to show autumn colors, marking the seasonal transition that would bring Harold's 79th birthday and Kaiser's 9th, ages they'd never expected to reach together 6 months earlier. That evening, as 3 generations of family gathered in Harold's living room for their traditional Sunday dinner, Kaiser rested peacefully on his favorite rug, surrounded by the voices and laughter of people who loved him unconditionally. The German Shepherd's presence had transformed from simple companionship into something approaching grace, a daily reminder that loyalty, courage, and love could overcome even the most sophisticated evil. Harold looked around his home, filled with family and furnished with memories that no criminal could steal, and felt Emma's presence in the warmth and security they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more families to help, and continued vigilance against those who preyed on society's most vulnerable members. But tonight, in the glow of lamplight and family conversation, Harold Patterson was exactly where he belonged. Home with the people and the four-legged companion who'd taught him that sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as the worst defeats, and that love, when properly defended, really can conquer all. Dear friends, Harold's story reminds us of a profound truth that touches every American senior's heart. Our four-legged family members aren't just pets. They're lifelines to joy, purpose, and unconditional love that sustains us through life's loneliest chapters. At 78, Harold discovered that Kaiser wasn't just his companion, he was his guardian angel, his early warning system, and ultimately, his salvation. When grief clouds our judgment and isolation makes us vulnerable, our loyal friends see what we cannot. They sense danger before we recognize it, love us when we doubt ourselves, and fight for us even when we've given up fighting. Harold's near tragedy became his greatest blessing because it reconnected him with his granddaughter Sarah, rebuilt his community ties, and gave his retirement years a mission bigger than himself. The Emma and Kaiser Foundation now protects thousands of seniors and their beloved companions from predators who exploit our deepest bonds. Sometimes our darkest moments lead to our brightest chapters. The companionship that once felt like all we had left becomes the bridge to everything we thought we'd lost. Family gatherings, community connections, and the deep satisfaction of protecting others from heartbreak we've survived. What role has your pet played during your most challenging times? Have you ever noticed your companion animal trying to warn you about something that didn't seem right? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might help another senior recognize the wisdom their faithful friend is trying to share.